All right, good morning, RiverTree. Thank you for the introduction, PC. Like PC said, we're going to be continuing our series on John. Today's passage is going to be from John 4. It's a very familiar story if you know your Bible well, or if you've been to church a lot, you've probably heard sermons preached about this before. But I'd encourage you to follow carefully along. We're going to be really digging into just a few verses this morning, and we're going to be looking at some of the cultural context of those verses. So you're probably going to hear some details that you weren't familiar with. And even if you're not familiar with the story, or if you are, I'd encourage you later today or later this week to go ahead and read through John 4. It's our reading for the week anyways. We're not going to have time to go through the full passage. So it would be very beneficial to get the stuff that I skip over as I'm focusing on just a few verses. So, we're going to start with verse 3, and it says, "So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria." I'm emphasizing that word "had" because it's honestly the verse that stuck out to me when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about as being just really catching in a way that I'd never noticed before. And at first glance, it seems like it makes sense. I've got a little map here. My not read anymore line goes from Jerusalem at the bottom all the way up to Galilee at the top. So when Jesus is going back to Galilee, that seems like a pretty sensible way to go. You won't be able to see the detail on the map, but this is a map that shows the trade routes, the major roads at Jesus' time, and that line is pretty much covering one of them. So the road that Jesus is taking here is a major road, and it's the most direct way you could go back to Galilee. But no Jew at this time would ever take this route. The reason is because it goes through Samaria, and Samaritans did not get along with Jews. That's even an understatement. It was very dangerous for Jesus to be going down this road, and that is why no Jews would take it. Let's talk just a little bit about the history between the Samaritans and Jews. The Samaritans are first mentioned in the Bible in 2 Kings 17. They're a group of people who, after Israel was led into captivity in Assyria, they came and resettled that land. So they were around hundreds of years before Jesus, and there was conflict pretty much from the get-go between those people and the Jews. Now we know that the Samaritans believed in, or used as their Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible that we use today, but some of the details in their copies were different than what we know. A big example is that when God told the Jews to build a temple in Jerusalem, in their version, it was to build a temple on a mountain called Gerizim. So if we go back to our map, right in the middle of that line is where that mountain was. Now, there actually wasn't a temple there anymore by the time we get to Jesus' day, because about 150 years before this story happens, the Jews were independent. They had a rare moment in their history where they weren't entangled with any foreign powers. They weren't being dominated by anyone. They were completely independent. And one of the things they did is they went to the Samaritans and they destroyed that temple, which is a big deal. I mean, we're people who don't value place as much as these people did, or as the Jews did at this time. But I've been to our meetings talking about where we're going to be meeting in the future, and people still care about that a lot, even here. I know people have been very passionate about that, those decisions that we're in the process of making. So you can imagine, for a people where you think, this is the particular place where I have to go to meet God, and the Jews destroy it, that's a huge deal. Well, the Samaritans got back at the Jews just a few years before Jesus was born. What they did is they snuck into the temple before Passover and spread a bunch of bones all over the temple. Now, One, it would just be disgusting. But it also created a big dilemma for religious Jews. Either you had to go to the temple and become ritually unclean by coming into contact with all these bones, and what that meant is you would then have to spend up to a week going through all of these rituals. We actually talked about some of the ritual uncleanness stuff a couple weeks ago, if you were here for that. But it meant that they were going to be taking a good week out where they couldn't spend time with their families, they couldn't be a part of the communities that they knew, if they choose to go to the temple. The other option was to not go to the temple at all and miss Passover, which was the big feast of the year that they were supposed to go to. So it put those religious Jews that year in a big dilemma. And again, obviously, we value place less. But if we showed up on Easter Sunday and someone had put dead bones all over where we're going to worship, we'd be pretty offended by that. So that's just a little bit of the history leading up to this, what was going on between that. So you can now imagine, now when the Bible says Jesus had to go through Samaria, now suddenly it doesn't make sense at all. Why would Jesus have to do that? Well, I think the text gives us a strong reason later in the passage. Jesus, talking to the disciples, will say, the fields are ripe for the harvest. When the disciples will come later to Jesus and say, why are you doing all this stuff? And he tells the Samaritan woman later that true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So I would suggest Jesus went to Samaria with the intention of sharing a message that he thought was very relevant to the Samaritans. It was something that they needed to hear and would change them. And it was something they were ready to hear. When he says to the disciples that the fields were ripe for the harvest, he says, I know the Samaritans are ready to hear this message, and they will accept it. So he obviously set out on this journey from the beginning with a strong motivation and an intention to share this message. Let's see what happens when he gets there. The text says, Jacob's well was there. This is at the town where Jesus stops. And Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down on the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples had gone into town to buy food. So I'm going to pick out this one little detail here. Looks like my slides did not work the way I wanted to. So the part about, it was about noon. First of all, the historical context. We know from other details in the story it is likely summertime. It's Israel. I've had the opportunity to go to Israel about 10 years ago, and I went in the summertime. It's very hot at noon. When I was there, it was typically 100 to 120 degrees at noon. So intensely hot. And it's noon, so it's the hottest part of the day. So to say Jesus was thirsty, this intensifies that. He is, I'm sure, very tired, very hot. When I was there, I was literally drinking gallons of water a day when I was hiking across the countryside of Israel in 120-degree weather. So Jesus is deeply in need for a drink. He really, really needs it. At the same time, I think this is poetic language by the gospel writer. Earlier in John, Jesus is called the witness to the light. And in John 3, Jesus will say to Nicodemus, whoever lives by the truth comes into the light. So obviously John is using light as a symbol in a lot of the passages that we've encountered so far in John. And now it's midday. It's as bright as it's going to get. So clearly we should now be expecting to see something of God's truth revealed. We should be expecting to see those who worship in truth coming into the light, well, coming into the light. And who's showing up? Well, a woman is. A Samaritan woman. not who you would necessarily expect. Now, it's interesting, too, going back to the historical side, that a Samaritan woman would show up to the well at this time. Again, if you just think about this logically, if you wanted to go get some water, you probably wouldn't pick the time of day to go in the middle of the day. You'd go when it's cooler out. And that's typically what people did. Women at that time, as a group, would go at dusk to draw water for the next day and then return to their families. So here we have a Samaritan woman, singular, going to the well. And that tells us something about her. It tells us at least that she's a social outcast. She's going by herself. No one else is going with her. And she's going at a time when she knows no one else will go either. So she's going to be away from anyone else. That's the minimum, and some of the other details that we hear about her later suggest that she's someone who has maybe had a bad reputation, maybe was known for her promiscuity. So she's probably more than just a social outcast. She's someone that the town would probably gossip about, would probably shake their heads at when they see her, and probably would, talk to their daughters and sons and say, yeah, don't be like her. That's who shows up into the light. Very unexpected. Now, when Jesus asks, will you give me a drink, the implication here is that he can't do it himself, and that, given the culture, also is fitting. Groups at that time would typically carry a bucket with them. Wells in the Middle East do not have a bucket attached like we typically think of. So you'd bring one with you. And if we recall, Jesus sent the disciples into town, so presumably they did have a bucket, but the disciples were the ones who had it. So here's Jesus. He's by himself. He has no way of getting water. And now he has someone who can help him. So interestingly enough, we already know Jesus set out with a purpose in mind. I'm going to go share this message. But he doesn't start with that. He starts with, will you help me? And what we see here is a very human Jesus, a Jesus who's in need, which is a stark contrast from what we've seen before. John, probably more than any other gospel, emphasizes the divinity of Jesus. In the previous stories we've looked at, Jesus is very in control. Jesus is talked about in very high terms. And here Jesus is tired and probably dusty, and he's thirsty, and he's in need. And this is that light coming to show us the truth. So he starts by humbling himself. Just like we see throughout Jesus' life, Jesus humbles himself by entering into the world as a human being. This story personifies Jesus humbling himself before others. And he puts himself not only where he needs help, but he puts himself where he can get help from others. I think that's a really good example for us, and we'll come back to that a little bit towards the end. Okay, so let's see what the Samaritan woman says. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jewish man, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans," says the editorial little note there from John. Now, I actually slightly changed the translation here. In the translation I've been quoting, which is the NIV, it says, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman." I think you really have to translate it as "you are a Jewish man and a Samaritan woman." And the reason why is because they are speaking either Hebrew or Aramaic, and it doesn't matter which. When this phrase is said, the word Jew and Samaritan are both gendered, meaning you'll always be saying Jewish man or Jewish woman when you say it. So there is a clear contrast between both parts. She's saying, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan." And she's also saying, "You're a man and I'm a woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" So on my slide, I put there's 3 possible meanings. There's actually 4 that I think are important. One that we've already talked about a little bit, so I won't go too into detail. The first meaning is, given the history between Jews and Samaritans at this point, why are we even talking? What's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. What are you even doing in Samaria? And we'll see this more later as well. The town that they're in is right next to that mountain where the Samaritan temple used to be. So you can imagine the Samaritan woman is almost looking at that temple that was destroyed by the Jews in the background and saying, "What are you doing here? Why would you be here, and what do you expect me to do for you?" Another part of it is another piece of the ritual uncleanness again. Jews and Samaritans didn't associate with each other, and it was so bad that anything that a Samaritan touched was considered by Jewish people to be unclean. So once again, if the Samaritan woman draws this water for Jesus and puts it in a cup for him and hands it to him, any religious Jew would say, "I can't take that. I'm going to be ritually unclean, so I'm going to have to go through this whole cleansing ritual process for the next week before I can see anyone else that I know." So the implication here is she's asking, you don't care about that? Because it seems like you should, but Jesus asking her for water Jesus is saying, no, I don't care that much about that. He's saying this interaction that we're having, to me, that's more important than this social convention that I've grown up with, this tradition that I've had. There's also the implication, or 2 kind of pieces to the man and woman contrast. In Middle Eastern culture, men do not talk to women. This is true even today. If you went pretty much anywhere in the Middle East, in traditional society, a man will not talk to any woman unless they're a relative of his. So to see Jesus talking to a woman openly in public is extremely weird. And I was thinking about what I can compare it to in our culture, because to us, that's nothing. But I think it would be something like if one of us decided to go running through the middle of the mall this afternoon naked. That would be how shocking of a thing it would be to do. So she's saying, like, what's going on? Do you just not care about that? This is super weird. There's also a piece to it where she's possibly flirting with Jesus, or at least trying to gauge Jesus' intentions, because when Jesus is doing this, it kind of implies that he might be interested in her for other reasons, and she might be saying, what are you here for? So I would note that the way Jesus has acted so far, he is saying, I don't care about those social conventions. I don't care about the ritual uncleanness part, and I don't care that I'm breaking the gender social conventions either. Or at least I don't care about them enough to worry about it. This is more important to me than those things. The kind of provocative side of it, he just basically ignores. He kind of comes back to it a little bit later, and we don't have time to get into it too much. But it seems like Jesus just kind of redirects to a different topic and basically just lets that piece of it drop to kind of tell her, no, that's not what I'm here for. All right, so Jesus ends up in a conversation with this woman that you'll have to read about later this afternoon or this week. And the kind of conclusion of it is, "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. A time is coming when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." And then a few verses later, the text says, "Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, Come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? I think we can learn a lot from Jesus' method here of interacting with this woman and from the unexpected messenger. Jesus was very intentional about bringing this message that he ends up at the end to places and people that you wouldn't expect. It is very bizarre for Jesus to go to Samaria. It's not something that anyone that was a religious Jew would do because it was dangerous. They were the enemy. They were people they didn't get along with. They just weren't people that you would ever associate with. So Jesus was very intentional about that. And I think that is something that we can kind of take from this story and say, we also need to be intentional about engaging others, even people that you wouldn't expect. So that means people that would never darken the doorway of a church. Yeah, those are people that Jesus expects us to be taking the message to. It means people that maybe used to be Christians and now have nothing to do with it. Yeah, those are people that we should be intentional about interacting with. But Jesus also shows us a way to do it. And I think that's a very important part. Jesus humbles himself, and he was vulnerable with his needs. He genuinely needed this Samaritan woman, who wasn't at the start on board with Jesus' message at that point. And I think about the history of the church. The church has had a long history of seeking power. And even today, we build hospitals, we give gifts of money. A lot of times we're in a position where we have all of the stuff, all of the things that we need, and we have all the power in the situation, and then we're giving it to others. Now, I'm not saying those things are necessarily bad, but I think we need to also be very intentional about needing others. Yes, that means needing things from people who aren't believers, from people that society would look down on. So the lowest of the low that you can imagine, yeah, we need that person's companionship. We need something from that person. So if we go into a relationship with someone, we go, I know the truth, I'm going to tell you about it. That's just not the way Jesus does it. That's not the example he sets for us. He doesn't show us a way where we have all the answers and all the power and need nothing from others. It's a very mutual exchange sort of a thing. So finally, I think we can learn a lot as well about the unexpected messenger that Jesus sends. The woman shows us that even a social outcast, even someone who everyone in that town probably laughed at and gossiped about, can be a fitting messenger to her community. So if you're someone who goes, well, yeah, sharing the gospel and things like that, well, that's pretty intimidating to me. I don't know all the ins and outs of theology. I'm not a very eloquent speaker. I don't know how I'd even do that. Yeah, well, Jesus is still talking to you. Jesus even picks out the lowest of the low, I think intentionally, of his community, and he transformed her. So now if you're thinking, well, how do I do it? We can also see an example from the woman. If we go back to the passage, she says, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? We could unpack this more, but I'll suggest for now, her message is, this is how Jesus transformed me. Her message is simply what happened to her, how her life was changed. You don't necessarily need to have a long theological explanation. Your message is simply the way God has transformed you. So those are the two things I would like to leave with you today. How has God transformed you? Think about that. You should have an answer for that. God should be making a difference in your life, and if he has, that's your message. That's how you can share. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be the best speaker or the best at explaining things. You simply need to have a message of how God changed you. And she goes back to a people that she's familiar with as well. She goes back to her community. Now, she's kind of a social outcast in that community, but nevertheless, she has one. So who then is your community? Every one of us here has people that we know. And we all have very different circles, too. It's one of the things I love about RiverTree is we have a wide diversity of backgrounds that we come from. So if you think about it, each one of us has a mission to those that we know. And it's a wide variety of groups, and we can reach so many more people that way by just being intentional about sharing the way God has changed us to those that we know. I'm going to end with a prayer, and then the band can come up as well. Father in heaven, thank you for giving us your word to guide us, your Son to be an example to us of a love that gives of itself, of a love that humbles oneself, so that we can see the ways that we need other people. Help us to go out this week and be intentional about needing other people and about the way you have transformed our lives and letting that show. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.